The purpose for this video is to answer one very simple question: do current drug laws violate the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms lists all of the rights and freedoms we have in Canada. It is part of our Constitution and is the highest law in Canada. All other law must conform to it. The Charter includes familiar laws such as Section 7. Everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of the person and the right not to be deprived thereof except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Section 9. Everyone has the right not to be arbitrarily detained or imprisoned. Of all the sections in the Charter, Section 1 is not only the most important, but it is perhaps the least understood. This is because Section 1 is a bit different than all of the other rights. Rather than being a direct and straightforward right or freedom like Sections 7 and 9 I included above, instead it is simply a guarantee that we have all of the other rights and freedoms in the Charter, and states that any limit that is placed on any of our other rights and freedoms has to be reasonable, and it must be demonstrated why it is reasonable. This leaves us with a question: how do we determine if a limit is reasonable? The Charter of Rights became law in 1982. In 1986, that very question was asked in the very famous R versus Oakes case, and from the case, a test for reasonableness was established that has since become the standard that is used to decide if any laws that place limits on any of our rights and freedoms are in fact reasonable. Now that you know the basics, let's go through this again using drug laws as an example. In Canada, the limits drug laws place on our rights and freedoms are part of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, but are the limits reasonable? According to the Oakes test, in order for the limits to be considered reasonable, two central criteria must be satisfied. The first criteria states, the objective, which the measures responsible for a limit are designed to serve, must be of sufficient importance to warrant overriding a constitutionally protected right or freedom. Basically, this first criteria simply refers to the intent or reason for placing any limits on our rights and freedoms, and in the case of drug laws, the intent is obviously an effort to protect people and society from harm. Since this is a good reason, I consider the first criteria to be satisfied. However, the second criteria states, the party invoking Section 1 must then show that the means chosen are reasonable and demonstrably justified, which involves a form of proportionality test having three elements. The three elements state, the measures adopted must be carefully designed to achieve the objective in question. They must not be arbitrary, unfair or based on irrational considerations. The means, even if rationally connected to the objective in the first sense, should impair as little as possible the right or freedom in question. There must be a proportionality between the effects of the measures, and the objective which has been identified as of sufficient importance. Additionally, paragraph 66 of the R versus Oakes case states, the onus of proving that a limit on a right or freedom guaranteed by the Charter is reasonable, and demonstrably justified, in a free and democratic society, rests upon the party seeking to uphold the limitation. In other words, it is the government's responsibility to show that a limit to any right or freedom in the Charter is reasonable, by showing that the limits pass all the elements of the Oakes test. Even though it is technically the government's responsibility to show that the limits drug laws place on our rights and freedoms are reasonable, there is nothing preventing us from figuring that out for ourselves. To do this, we need to look at the House of Commons and Senate records from when the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act was first being discussed as Bill C-7, Bill C-8 and try to determine if the three elements of the second criteria of the Oakes test have been satisfied. One last thing. I won't be including every quote from the debates in Parliament showing that three elements of the Oakes test have not been satisfied, because I have found almost 300 examples. I have 184 examples of element A not being met, 69 examples of element B not being met, and 26 examples of element C not being met. It's not a coincidence that I found mostly examples of element A, less examples of element B, and even less for element C, but just a simple matter of incomplete research. It took many weeks just to find every file that related to the debates for Bill C-7, Bill C-8 and then reading them. After I read the files once and bookmarked every related page, I went through all the bookmarked pages, searching for examples that showed element A of the Oakes test has not been met. I did go through every file I have looking for examples related to element A, so I've probably found most of them. However, after seeing how many examples I found for element A, and having spent a few weeks in front of my computer, when I started going through the files for a third time looking for examples relating to element B, I went through everything a lot less carefully, and I have no doubt there are a lot more element B examples that I missed. By the time I started looking for element C examples, I simply stopped as soon as I had the 26, because it was beyond obvious at that point that the Oakes test has not been satisfied. It wasn't just the surprising number of examples I found, but as you're about to see, the specific things that were said, and the specific people who said them, left me completely astonished at the level of incompetence and complete disregard towards the Constitution that took place when they created the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. To make things a bit more interesting, the 10 examples I picked showing each element has not been satisfied, are all from the very first day of debates in the House of Commons, and only from 3 different MPs. This should also show I didn't just pick 10 of the best examples. If I had picked the best examples, I would have included quotes from people like Mr. John Conroy, chair of the Committee on Imprisonment and Release, Canadian Bar Association, telling senators in a subcommittee meeting on behalf of the Canadian Bar Association that, "We submit that the whole approach is wrong. We should be looking at decriminalization." And that was just the first such example that came to mind. Follow me on Twitter for a new example every day. Link is below.